They filled arenas, topped the charts, and helped define what country music sounded like at its peak. But when the spotlight moved on, many of these legends were left behind. This video tells the stories of 9 country icons who didn't go out in scandal or headlines, but in silence and debt. Once celebrated by Nashville, they spent their final years forgotten, financially broken, and far from the glory that once defined their names. George Jones. At his peak, George Jones was not just a star. He was the voice of heartbreak itself. Songs like He Stopped Loving Her Today and The Grand Tour turned him into a standard by which all country singers were measured. Nashville spoke his name with reverence. Promoters sold out arenas simply by putting him on the bill. For a time, it seemed impossible that someone so essential to the genre could ever fall. But behind the legend, the cracks were already forming. Alcohol and cocaine slowly took control of Jones's life, and with them came chaos. Missed shows became routine. Tours collapsed without warning. Record labels grew cautious. Managers came and went. Money poured in during good years, then vanished just as quickly. Despite earning millions across decades, Jones repeatedly found himself broke, owing taxes, and relying on others to keep him afloat. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, George Jones was becoming more famous for not showing up than for singing. Nashville never officially turned its back on him, but the silence grew louder. Fewer prime bookings, less industry patience. While younger artists rose, Jones became a problem rather than a pillar. His reputation followed him everywhere, quietly closing doors that once swung open. Even when he staged artistic comebacks, the financial damage was permanent. Medical bills piled up. Decades of substance abuse left him physically broken. He sold assets, lost control of parts of his catalog, and depended heavily on his wife, Nancy, to manage what remained of his career and finances. The man whose voice once defined country music could no longer support himself without constant intervention. In his final years, George Jones was respected but distant. He was honored at award shows, praised in documentaries, and spoken of as a legend. Yet, behind the scenes, his life was marked by debt, declining health, and the quiet reality that past success had not secured his future. When he died in 2013, the tributes were loud. But the years leading up to that moment were anything but. George Jones did not end his life in scandal or headlines. He ended it in silence, weighed down by debt, a cautionary tale of how even the greatest voice in country music could be left vulnerable once the spotlight faded. At his height, Lefty Frizzell wasn't just successful, he reshaped country music itself. His relaxed phrasing, emotional delivery, and conversational timing changed how singers approached a song. Hits like If You've Got the Money, I've Got the Time made him a dominant force in the early 1950s, and his influence reached far beyond chart positions. Artists like Merle Haggard and George Jones openly credited Frizzell as a blueprint for their own styles. For a time, Lefty was country music's future. But success arrived too fast, and discipline never followed. Frizzell developed a heavy drinking habit early in his career, and as his fame grew, so did his dependence on alcohol. Missed appearances, erratic behavior, and clashes with labels became increasingly common. While his voice remained powerful, his reliability did not. Nashville began to view him as a risk rather than an asset. By the late 1950s, the industry had already started to drift away. Musical trends changed, younger artists emerged, and Frizzell struggled to adapt. His releases became inconsistent, and radio support faded. Unlike some peers who reinvented themselves, Lefty remained trapped between past glory and present decline. Financially, the consequences were severe. Poor money management, combined with reduced income, left him constantly short of cash despite his legendary status. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Frizzell was still recording and occasionally touring, but the scale was dramatically smaller. He no longer commanded major stages or industry attention. Alcohol had taken a visible toll on his health, and medical problems added further strain. Bills mounted. Royalties were limited. The man whose style shaped a generation was now fighting simply to stay afloat. By the time of his death in 1975, Lefty Frizzell had all but disappeared from Nashville's inner circle. There was no major comeback, no industry rescue, and no financial security waiting at the end. He died from a stroke at just 47 years old, worn down by years of addiction, neglect, and financial instability. The silence surrounding his passing reflected the silence that had already surrounded the final chapter of his life. Lefty Frizzell didn't fall in a blaze of scandal. He faded slowly, quietly, and painfully. His influence lived on in others, but his own life ended weighed down by debt, illness, and the quiet realization that shaping history does not guarantee protection from it. Hank Williams Jr. For much of his career, Hank Williams Jr. lived under a shadow no one else could escape. Being the son of Hank Williams meant inheriting not only a legendary name, but impossible expectations. Early on, Nashville tried to mold him into a replica of his father, forcing him to sing the same songs, wear the same suits, and relive a legacy that wasn't his own. For years, he struggled both creatively and financially, trapped in a role that limited his independence and earnings. His breakthrough finally came in the late 1970s and 1980s, when he reinvented himself. Blending country with Southern rock, Hank Jr. became a powerhouse. Albums sold in the millions, stadiums filled. He was everywhere, on radio, on television, and eventually as the voice of Monday Night Football. At his peak, he was one of the most commercially successful figures in country music, seemingly untouchable. But that dominance proved fragile. Hank Jr.'s outspoken personality increasingly clashed with an industry that preferred compliance over controversy. Over time, political remarks and public statements made him radioactive to sponsors and broadcasters. In 2011, ESPN abruptly cut ties with him, ending a relationship that had provided both massive visibility and steady income for decades. Overnight, one of his most reliable financial pillars disappeared. What followed was not a public collapse, but something quieter. Tours became less prominent, media invitations dried up, radio support weakened. While he was far from poor, the momentum that once guaranteed revenue slowed dramatically. Behind the scenes, decades of medical issues, injuries, and lifestyle excess had already taken a toll. Expenses remained high as income became unpredictable. For long stretches, Hank Williams Jr. existed in a kind of industry exile, too legendary to be erased completely, yet too controversial to be fully embraced. Nashville didn't attack him, it simply stopped calling. The silence was unmistakable. Financial pressure mounted during these years, especially as mainstream platforms closed their doors. The artist who once dominated primetime television was suddenly pushed to the margins of relevance. Unlike others on this list, Hank Williams Jr. survived this chapter. But the period still fits the theme with chilling accuracy. There was a time when his career didn't end in applause, but in absence. No scandal headlines, no dramatic farewell, just contracts ending, opportunities disappearing, and a slow realization that even massive success can vanish when the industry decides to move on. Hank Williams Jr.'s story is a reminder that in country music, fame is not a shield, it is a loan. And sometimes, it's called back when you least expect it. Mel Street. Mel Street never chased superstardom, and perhaps that was part of his tragedy. He possessed a deep, aching voice, perfectly suited for heartbreak ballads, and among industry insiders, he was widely respected as a singer's singer. Songs like Borrowed Angel and Smoky Mountain Memories earned him loyal fans and consistent radio play during the 1970s. On stage, he carried himself like a man who understood pain not as a performance, but as lived experience. Yet despite steady chart success, Mel Street was never financially secure. His records sold modestly, not massively. He toured constantly, often playing smaller venues that paid just enough to survive, but never enough to build real wealth. Unlike the arena stars of his era, Street lived show to show, relying on road income to cover mounting personal and professional expenses. Fame for him came without financial insulation. Behind the scenes, his life was unraveling. Chronic health problems plagued him for years, leading to frequent hospital visits and rising medical bills. At the same time, his marriage collapsed in a bitter divorce that devastated him emotionally and financially. The combination of illness, legal costs, and shrinking income placed him under enormous pressure. While his voice remained powerful, his life offstage was defined by exhaustion and despair. As Nashville's sound began to shift in the late 1970s, Mel Street found himself increasingly isolated. Radio trends changed. Labels focused on younger, more marketable artists. His records received less promotion and tour opportunities dwindled. There was no dramatic firing, no public rejection, just a gradual fading from relevance. The silence crept in quietly but relentlessly. Financially, the situation became dire. With limited savings and no safety net, Street struggled to keep up with basic obligations. Debts accumulated. Friends later recalled that he felt trapped, overwhelmed by problems he could no longer outrun on the road. The man whose songs spoke so clearly about loneliness was now living that loneliness in real time. In 1978, Mel Street died by suicide at the age of 44. There were no major headlines, no industry reckoning. His death passed quietly through Nashville, another troubled artist lost without ceremony. In the years that followed, his name faded further, remembered mainly by devoted fans and collectors who understood the depth of his work. Mel Street's story is one of talent without protection. He didn't die rich, he didn't die celebrated. He died burdened by debt, illness, and silence. Proof that in country music, even honesty and hard work are sometimes not enough to survive. David Allan Coe. For a time, David Allan Coe embodied everything outlaw country stood for. He rejected Nashville's polish, embraced controversy, and built a reputation as a fearless outsider. Songs like You Never Even Called Me by My Name and Would You Lay With Me in a Field of Stone turned him into a cult icon, especially among fans who saw him as a voice of brutal honesty. Coe didn't need industry approval to sell records or draw crowds, or so it seemed. Behind the rebellious image, his career was always financially unstable. Unlike mainstream stars with corporate backing, Coe operated on the fringes of the industry. He often financed projects himself, toured relentlessly, and depended on irregular income streams. While his name was famous, his earnings were inconsistent. Royalties fluctuated, management was chaotic, and long-term financial planning was almost non-existent. As the years passed, Coe's relationship with Nashville deteriorated further. Controversial material, especially unreleased and underground recordings, damaged his standing with labels and promoters. Radio distanced itself. Major tours became rare. What remained was a loyal but shrinking fan base, insufficient to support the lifestyle he had once lived. Slowly, the outlaw became isolated, not just creatively, but financially. By the 1990s and 2000s, the silence had settled in. Coe was no longer part of country music's mainstream conversation. He continued performing, but mostly in smaller venues, far from the spotlight he once commanded. At various points, he lost control over portions of his catalog, limiting his income even further. Legal issues and disputes over rights added to the strain. Fame, it turned out, did not equal security. In his later years, Coe lived quietly and largely out of public view. Health problems mounted, including serious injuries and illness that restricted his ability to tour, his primary source of income. Without regular touring, financial pressure intensified. Despite his legendary status, there was no industry safety net. Nashville did not come calling with tributes or support. The outlaw was left to manage alone. What makes David Allan Coe's story particularly striking is the contrast between image and reality. On stage and on record, he projected defiance and freedom. Offstage, his life reflected the harsh cost of existing outside the system for too long. He was not ruined by a single scandal, nor destroyed by one fatal mistake. He was slowly worn down by instability, marginalization, and financial uncertainty. David Allan Coe did not end his life in applause. He faded into silence, burdened by the consequences of independence without protection. His story is a reminder that in country music, rejecting the system may preserve your voice, but it does not guarantee your survival. For a brief moment, Johnny Paycheck had everything country music promised. His voice was raw, defiant, and unmistakably working class. When Take This Job and Shove It exploded in 1977, Paycheck became a symbol of rebellion for blue-collar America. The song shot to #1, sold millions, and turned him into a household name almost overnight. Nashville saw him as a cash machine. Fans saw him as one of their own. But Paycheck's rise was built on unstable ground. Long before fame arrived, he had lived a turbulent life marked by substance abuse, violence, and impulsive behavior. Success didn't soften those traits, it amplified them. Cocaine and alcohol consumed him, and paranoia followed. He spent recklessly, trusted the wrong people, and ignored warnings that his career was slipping out of control. Money came fast and disappeared faster. By the early 1980s, the silence had begun. Radio stopped playing his records. Tours dried up. Labels lost patience. What followed was not a dramatic fall, but a slow, humiliating unraveling. In 1985, Paycheck shot a man during a dispute, a moment that sealed his fate in Nashville. He served time in prison, and when he emerged, the industry had moved on without him. The years that followed were defined by financial ruin. Paycheck owed back taxes, legal fees, and medical bills. Royalties from his biggest hit barely kept him afloat, as much of the money had already been spent or lost. He lived modestly, sometimes relying on friends and fans for help. The man whose anthem had once echoed through factories and bars now struggled just to survive. Unlike many legends, Paycheck never received a true comeback. There were no major tours, no industry redemption arc. His name faded quietly from country music's conversation. Younger fans barely knew who he was. Older ones remembered him only through a single song, unaware of the cost behind it. When Johnny Paycheck died in 2003, there was no grand farewell from Nashville, no massive tribute concert, just a brief acknowledgement that one of country music's most defiant voices was gone. He didn't die rich. He didn't die celebrated. He died burdened by debt, mistakes, and the quiet reality that rebellion, without control, often comes with a devastating price. Stonewall Jackson. In the early 1960s, Stonewall Jackson was everywhere. With hits like Waterloo and BJ the DJ, he became a staple of country radio and a familiar face on the Grand Ole Opry. His voice was warm and approachable, his songs tailored perfectly to the era's sound. For a time, Jackson represented stability, a reliable hitmaker in a rapidly growing industry. But beneath that steady image, the foundation was fragile. Like many artists of his generation, Jackson signed contracts that favored labels and publishers, not performers. While his records sold well, ownership and long-term royalties slipped out of his control. Money came in, but not at the level his success suggested. As newer stars emerged and the sound of country music shifted, Jackson's income narrowed rather than expanded. By the late 1960s, radio began to move on. His releases received less promotion, and chart success became sporadic. Stonewall Jackson never had a dramatic public downfall, no scandal, no explosive controversy. Instead, his career slowly cooled. Nashville didn't push him out, it simply stopped prioritizing him. The silence arrived gradually, making it harder to fight. Financially, the consequences were lasting. Without strong control over his catalog, Jackson's royalty income was limited. Touring opportunities declined, and what remained paid far less than in his peak years. While his name still carried respect among traditional fans, respect didn't translate into financial security. The gap between his legendary status and his actual earnings widened with every passing year. In the decades that followed, Jackson lived a quiet life far removed from the spotlight. Health problems eventually made performing impossible, cutting off one of his final sources of income. Unlike younger artists who could monetize nostalgia through large reunion tours, Jackson belonged to an era that offered little protection once the hits stopped coming. He became a footnote in history rather than an active participant in it. When Stonewall Jackson passed away in 2021, tributes focused on his classic songs and his role in country music's golden age. What went largely unspoken were the long years of financial strain and obscurity that defined his later life. He was honored in memory, but unsupported in reality. The industry remembered his voice, not his vulnerability. Stonewall Jackson didn't collapse in disgrace. He endured something quieter and in many ways crueler. He outlived his relevance, lost control of the work that made him famous, and spent his final years in near silence, financially constrained, and largely forgotten by the machine he once helped fuel. Roy Drusky had one of the most distinctive voices in country music. His deep, smooth baritone set him apart in an era dominated by higher, sharper tones. In the early 1960s, songs like Yes, Mr. Peters and Three Hearts in a Tangle made him a familiar presence on country radio. He wasn't a flashy star, but he was respected, dependable, and consistently successful within the industry's traditional core. Yet, from the beginning, Drusky's career was built more on artistry than financial leverage. He never cultivated a larger-than-life image, and as a result, he was rarely positioned as a headline attraction. His records sold well enough to keep him visible, but not well enough to create lasting wealth. Like many artists of his generation, he signed contracts that limited his control over royalties and publishing, trading long-term security for short-term exposure. As the 1970s approached, country music began to change. The sound grew slicker, the marketing more aggressive, and younger artists were pushed to the forefront. Drusky's traditional style no longer fit the direction Nashville was chasing. Radio support faded, and his recording output slowed. There was no announcement, no final album framed as a farewell. His presence simply diminished, replaced by newer voices with broader commercial appeal. Financially, the decline was quiet but damaging. Without strong royalty income and with fewer touring opportunities, Drusky's earnings shrank steadily. He continued to perform, often in small venues and package shows, but the pay barely sustained him. Health problems further complicated matters, making travel and live performance increasingly difficult. Each setback reduced his ability to generate income, tightening the financial pressure. By the 1980s and 1990s, Roy Drusky had all but disappeared from the mainstream country conversation. Younger fans didn't recognize his name, and even longtime listeners rarely heard his songs anymore. He lived modestly, far removed from the success he once enjoyed. There were no major revivals, no rediscovery moment that restored his standing or finances. Nashville had moved on, and it did so without looking back. When Drusky died in 2004, the response was muted. A few respectful mentions acknowledged his contributions, but there was no widespread reflection on the long silence that preceded his death. He had not fallen in scandal or controversy. He had simply been forgotten, left to navigate his final years with limited resources and diminishing recognition. Roy Drusky's story captures a harsh truth about country music's middle class. You can have hits, respect, and a lasting voice, and still end your life quietly, struggling financially, once the industry no longer has a place for you. Charlie Louvin. Charlie Louvin was never chasing fame on his own. As one half of the Louvin brothers, he helped create some of the most haunting and influential harmony recordings in country music history. Songs like I Don't Believe You've Met My Baby and When I Stop Dreaming became pillars of the genre, shaping generations of singers who followed. Critics praised their artistry, and historians later placed them among country music's most important acts. But artistic importance did not translate into financial security. From the beginning, the Louvin brothers operated under contracts that heavily favored record labels and publishers. The money they earned rarely reflected the cultural weight of their work. When the duo split in the early 1960s, largely due to personal conflict and era Louvin's destructive behavior, Charlie was left to rebuild alone, without the financial cushion that decades of influence should have provided. As a solo artist, Charlie Louvin continued recording and performing, but on a much smaller scale. His solo career earned respect rather than profit. Radio support was limited, and touring opportunities paid modestly at best. While his peers moved into larger venues or benefited from industry reinvention, Louvin remained tied to a quieter path, one that offered little protection against financial decline. The tragedy deepened after Ira Louvin's death in 1965. While the brothers' legacy grew in hindsight, Charlie received little immediate benefit from the renewed appreciation of their work. Royalties remained thin, and the industry's recognition came mostly in words, not checks. By the time the Louvin brothers were inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2001, the honor carried prestige, but not financial relief. In his later years, Charlie Louvin lived simply and largely outside the spotlight. He continued to perform occasionally and even recorded acclaimed late-career albums, but these projects were labors of love, not sources of wealth. Medical expenses and the costs of aging added new pressure. Despite being revered by musicians and critics, Louvin's personal finances remained limited. When Charlie Louvin died in 2011, the tributes were heartfelt and sincere. Writers called him a pioneer. Artists praised his influence. Country music acknowledged its debt to his voice. Yet, the years leading up to his death told a quieter story, one of modest means, careful living, and an artist who never truly benefited from the empire his music helped build. Charlie Louvin did not end his life disgraced or abandoned. He ended it in silence, supported more by legacy than by income. His story is a reminder that in country music, being essential to history does not guarantee protection in life.